We are now in the process of defeating the radical left, the Marxists, the anarchists.
This is Marxism, and Marxism is based on the belief that no person has any value as an individual, that your value is that you're a member of a class. Second, Marxism is based on the belief that an employer and an employee, a worker and an owner, can't both help each other and both be better off. The worker gets good pay, the employer makes a profit on the capital they've invested. But his ideas are Marxist ideas, and Marxism always leads to authoritarianism and dictatorship eventually.
We often hear people talk about Marxism, whether describing horrors from communist regimes or when criticizing our current capitalist system. However, the term Marxism has become a common buzzword that is thrown around to disqualify anything and everything that you may not like, stripping it from any actual meaning. But the reality is that even if you disagree with it, Marxism can provide a very interesting lens through which to analyze, criticize, and try to improve our current system. Unfortunately, people who know enough about Marxism to try to explain it to someone else often also have a very strong feeling either towards or against it, and thus fail to provide an unbiased explanation. So, even though I am no expert, I will do my best in this video to try to finally give you an unbiased explanation of Marxism and how it affects the worldview of those who adhere to it. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you will have a few new arguments to own your dear family members during the next holiday season. In this video, I will explain some core Marxist concepts, such as the labor theory of value, the means of production, exploitation, and class struggle. Finally, I will discuss how Marxism views these concepts as core elements of a capitalist system and how they will lead to its inevitable collapse. At the core of Marxist thinking is something called the labor theory of value, which we need to understand before even dreaming of going any further. Under a capitalist organization of the economy, the basic element is the commodity, which Marx defines as something that was made by human labor, satisfies a demand, and is produced for the purpose of exchange. For example, if I bake a loaf of bread to eat, then it is simply a loaf of bread. But if I bake it with the purpose of exchanging it for something else, then it becomes a commodity. It is important to note that the product doesn't have to be palpable. It may be care given to a patient or knowledge transferred to a student. Here it is that we often see the first Marxist critique of capitalism. Under our current system, Marxists will argue, goods are not created for the consumption or use of the workers or bosses of the factories that produce them. Instead, goods in our system are produced for the sole purpose of being sold. We produce commodities regardless of whether or not they are actually useful or even needed at all, but rather if we believe that they are marketable or profitable. And this is a very important concept. Marxists believe that under capitalism, production is controlled by the profit motive and not by need. Now, any economic system where products are exchanged needs some way to determine the rate of exchange of said goods. This means how much of product 1, say bread, do you have to give up in order to acquire a different product, say a chair. Since determining how many loaves of bread is worth a single chair can be very difficult, the concept of money to mediate the exchange of goods arises naturally. Now the problem is, how do we determine whether a product is worth producing or not? Under capitalism, it is no secret that companies operate to create a profit. This means that companies start out with some amount of money which they will invest into a given product or service, which they will then sell for a higher amount of money than they started out with. The surplus amount of money here is what we call profit. None of this should sound strange to you, but now comes the fundamental question. Where does this profit come from? Now here it is that capitalists and Marxists will provide radically differing answers. Capitalists will argue that profits are created by capital itself. The machines, tools, factories, and other elements will produce goods that the forces of the market will drive to be sold at a higher price than the cost of the original inputs. Marxists, on the other hand, have a radically different explanation. Any capital or money that goes into the production process is transformed by the workers, which through their own labor create more value, allowing the final product to be sold at a higher price than the cost of the original inputs. In other words, it is the labor force that creates the value according to Marxism, not the bosses or the capital itself. This is the core of what Marxists call the labor theory of value, and its consequences are profound, as we will see shortly. According to this economic theory, the one property that all commodities have in common and through which their value can be determined is that they are all produced by human labor. Although the labor theory of value may not be mainstream today, the idea that labor was the source of wealth and value in society was considered an obvious point by classical political economists like Adam Smith. In fact, the first line of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation is, "The annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with the necessaries and conveniences of life." Later, he continues, "The real price of everything, what everything really costs to the man who wants to acquire it, is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. What everything is really worth to the man who has acquired it and who wants to dispose of it or exchange it for something else is the toil and trouble which it can save to himself and which it can impose upon other people. What is bought with money or with goods is purchased by labor as much as what we acquire by the toil of our own body. That money or those goods indeed save us this toil. They contain the value of a certain quantity of labor which we exchange for what is supposed at the time to contain the value of an equal quantity. Labor was the first price, the original purchase money that was paid for all things. It was not by gold or by silver, but by labor, that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased, and its value to those who possess it and who want to exchange it for some new productions is precisely equal to the quantity of labor which it can enable them to purchase or command." However, modern economists have thrown out this idea, fearing its explosive implications, which are precisely the basis of Marxist ideology. That is why mainstream economists today are called neoclassical rather than classical economists. They profess dedication to the likes of Adam Smith and Ricardo, but they have discarded the troubling labor theory of value. After all, if the producers of the wealth are the laborers and not the bosses, then the 1968 popular slogan, "The boss needs you, you don't need the boss," is not abstract hyperbole anymore, but actually a roadmap for the future. So where does the profit come from? Well, according to Marxism, the capitalist invests not in finished products, but actually buys two different kinds of commodities: the means of production and labor power. The means of production are the tools and materials that are necessary to make goods, such as factories, office buildings, lands, machinery, software, IT infrastructure, etc. The capitalist employs both inputs in a production process that creates a new set of commodities that is worth more than the sum of the original inputs. But the secret hidden within the production process to actually output something of greater worth than the combination of the inputs is a very special commodity called labor power. Marx claimed that the ability to work became a commodity under capitalism, which the capitalist buys from you in exchange for a wage. And due to the fact that the workers do not own the means of production, meaning that they do not own land, factories, or anything that they can live off of, their labor power has become the only commodity that they can sell. Which means that in a system where the capitalist owns the means of production, then the worker has no choice but to sell their ability to work to the capitalist under their terms and conditions. The exchange value of labor power is paid out in what we call a wage. But the exchange value of labor power and the value that the labor then produces for the bosses are two very different things. This means that the worker is paid one thing, but they will normally generate much more value than they are paid during their shift. This happens because the laborer enters an agreement where they are paid for the amount of time they work and not for the fruits of their labor. For example, let's say that you work at Starbucks and you are paid $120 for an 8-hour shift. At a busy store, you can probably make $120 worth of coffee in an hour or maybe 2. Even once you subtract the cost of materials and equipment, Starbucks doesn't pay you anywhere near the amount of money that you are generating for them. That is because they buy your labor power and not the fruits of your labor. If you make the value of your wage back in an hour, then the rest of your shift you're basically working for free. This is exactly what Marxists call exploitation. According to them, the capital owners do not pay the workers for the value that they actually create and are thus effectively stealing from them. That is a concept that is called wage theft and is currently an acceptable, legal, and even encouraged form of theft. Now, capitalists will often dismiss this claim, stating that it is the capital owner that creates the business and generates the job opportunity, and that workers will always be free to just move and find a different job. However, Marxists would disagree, because the fact that workers lack control over the means of production makes them dependent on capital. They are coerced by the threat of poverty to sell the only commodity that they have, which is their labor power. Through the threat of poverty, the worker loses the freedom to pursue other avenues of income. As a common Marxist saying goes, under capitalism, you are free to work or starve. The concept of exploitation naturally gives rise to the next core theme in Marxism. Because if the capital owner makes their profit by stealing from their employees, then we can immediately see that the position of the worker and the boss are in complete opposition. If the capital owner, whether by greed or by need, wants to increase their profit margins, then they can do so by increasing the rate of exploitation, which they can do by making their workers work more efficiently without increasing their wage, straight up decreasing their salaries, or even extending their shifts without an increase in pay. Or looking at this from the other way, increasing the wage and quality of life of the workers goes against the personal interests of the capital owner. This means that from a Marxist perspective, there exist two distinct groups. You have those who need to work for a living, which Marx calls the working class, and you have those who control the means of production and can rely on what they already have to provide for them. That is the capitalist class. And this is the basis for what Marxists call class struggle, a constant battle between these two classes, where the benefit of one inevitably means the detriment of the other. Every improvement in the workers' lives comes at the expense of the capitalist's profit. And vice versa, of course. Now, it is important to note that class struggle is not necessarily violent, at least not in the typical way. Workers can unionize, riot, protest, or even revolt, while capitalists can use state-sponsored violence to coerce the workers into submission. Now, let's take a moment to reflect on how this definition varies from what we usually think of from a capitalist point of view. Under capitalism, if this concept is even brought up at all, it is usually discussed from the point of view of wealth, social stratification, income levels, education, lifestyle, patterns of consumption, and other aspects which divide society into a large middle class with small outliers of rich and poor. Class is thus understood as a separation by the amount of income. It may be divided into quintiles, deciles, percentiles, but in the end it is simply a measure of how much money you get for your work. However, this concept is very different from the Marxist understanding of class. The Marxist understanding of class begins with the concept that the workers need to sell their ability to work, while capitalists buy and command that labor power. You can't understand either the workers' or the capitalist class position without understanding that the whole of the system is one setup where one group has to work in the means of production to produce a profit for someone else. Class, from a Marxist perspective, is, in other words, a relationship of exploitation. This understanding of class as a social relationship is completely absent from mainstream analysis. The Marxist explanation emphasizes that one's position in society is not measured quantitatively, but is determined by a person's relationship to labor, the fruits of their labor, and the means of production. Anyone who owns the means of production has political power, can dictate the terms of others' working conditions, or owns capital that can be invested, is a part of the capitalist class. And anyone who must sell their labor and has no access to the means of production is a part of the worker class. It is important to note that this doesn't extend only to workers engaged in the production of physical goods. Teachers and nurses, for example, also have to sell their ability to work in order to make a living, and thus they are also part of the working class. It is in this sense that Marx and Engels wrote that the proletarian is without property. Note that private property here doesn't mean personal belongings, like your TV or your laptop, but rather the means of production. The buildings, machinery, software, equipment, tools, and other materials are all owned by the capitalists. Marx wasn't saying that workers literally have nothing, even though that is sometimes and increasingly true. He meant that we are without any means to reproduce our livelihood and are thus at the mercy of capitalist exploitation. Using this definition, we can see that wealth and poverty do not determine class, but rather they are manifestations of it. The bosses are thus not defined by the degree of their extravagance. Poverty is an integral part of the experience of the working class, and unemployment is always just a stone's throw away for most workers. In fact, capitalism requires there to be some level of unemployment at all times, or as Marx called it, a reserve army of laborers. The bosses depend on this reserve army of laborers to ensure that there is always going to be someone else willing to take your job, and thus discipline the paid workforce into acquiescing to the terms set by the employers. We have already introduced the concepts of exploitation and class struggle. But at this point, we have to stop and clarify that these conducts are not driven by any individual capitalist on a Mr. Burns-like maniacal cackle. In fact, Marxists will agree that the behavior of any individual capitalist isn't but a manifestation of the system itself that rewards greedy and cruel behavior. Consider that modern capitalism is characterized by an immense expansion of wealth. Its entire history is marked by growth. The US economy, when healthy, grows by about 4% per year. The Chinese economy, until recently, was growing by as much as 10% per year. And the world economy as a whole is expanding by roughly 3% annually since the 1990s. In fact, if any country stops growing, it goes into a recession. So how is it that capitalists can generate this ever-expanding surplus? The answer, once again, is simple yet enlightening. They start with money, invest that money into commodities that they then sell back into the market for more than they started out with. Rather than money serving an intermediary role meant to facilitate the exchange of needed goods, has now become the driver of the production process. Capitalists don't exchange goods for the sake of qualitative enrichment. Steve Jobs didn't just decide he had more iPhones and MacBooks that he could possibly need, and thus he might as well exchange them for something he didn't have. A capitalist invests for the sole purpose of accruing further wealth. To exchange like-for-like items and wind up with the exact same of money that you started out with would be, as Marx put it, empty and absurd. The entire purpose of exchange is to accumulate surplus value, which forms the basis of capitalist profit. And even though the satisfaction of even the most extravagant of needs will only go so far, the boundless goal of acquiring money through its circulation is an inexhaustible endeavor. In fact, capitalism has left no stone unturned in its quest to commodify all living and non-living matter on the planet. From those as plentiful and mundane as water, to those as absurd and abstract as Wall Street's financial cocktail. If there is $1 to be made, capitalism will find a way to package it up and sell it. The explosion of goods in modern society is not only the result of the growing number of commodities in the market, but also a consequence of the number of things that are now considered marketable. And the types of things that are now for sale continue to increase as we commodify a greater and greater part of our lives. This has happened through the privatization of areas like healthcare and education, which used to be outside of the reach of the capitalist market. Rather than finding collective solutions to social problems, everything is now left to the machinations of the free market. So to survive and thrive in such a competitive market, business owners can get an edge over their competition by raising the rate of exploitation and thus making it easier to lower the cost of the goods that you produce. And so, this structure of the capitalist system rewards the Mr. Burns of the world and put out of business any bosses who promote fairness, equity, and job safety. We all know that competition is the beating heart of capitalism. It drives production forward, and as we will see, it fuels the dynamics of the system. No matter how special or wealthy any individual capitalist may think they are, reality is that no one can opt out of competing. Even powerful monopolists like Bill Gates can't stay ahead of the competition forever. It's important to note that capitalists are not necessarily drawn towards achieving ever-increasing profits merely to see themselves as the bigger man, nor is their drive for profit driven by an insatiable lust for more luxuries. Rather, they desperately need to accumulate more capital in order to get a hold of the newest, most efficient, labor-saving technology. The bigger the profit of an individual capitalist, then the quicker they will be able to invest into these new technologies and get ahead of their competition. Marx made the point that it is not enough to simply generate profit. It has to be reinvested. As a 2018 Oxfam report revealed, the richest 42 people own the same wealth as the world's 3.7 billion poorest people. In the US, the wealth of the 3 richest people equals the wealth of the bottom half of the population. And this gap is growing by the day. In the economic crisis emerging alongside the COVID-19 pandemic, the rich made a killing. According to the Institute for Policy Studies, between March 18 and April 10, 2020, over 22 million people lost their jobs in the United States, as the unemployment rate surged towards 15%. But over the same 3 weeks, US billionaire wealth increased by $282 billion, an almost 10% gain. Yet despite their preposterous lifestyles and the growing inequality between the rich and the poor, even capitalists are mere cogs in the system. According to Marxism, capitalists are driven by the system to behave in greedy and abusive ways, in order to remain profitable in the treacherous sea that is the free market. History is ridden with examples of companies that failed to innovate and ended up going under. Consider Blockbuster, once a multi-billion-dollar company with over 9,000 stores and 60,000 employees. Now they are completely gone. So we see that in reality, the process of generating wealth cannot be a linear one with a beginning and an end. Rather, it has to be a continuous process, spiraling in growth. When the system is running smoothly, capitalists don't just sit on their money they have made. Profits have to be shuffled back into the next round of production. This spiraling buildup of wealth brings us to the definition of capital as the self-expansion of value. On an individual basis, each capitalist is compelled to expand profits on investments or face insolvency. But on a system-wide level, this translates to an economy that must grow without bounds. So, how can companies grow? Marx identified two key dynamics in the scaling up of companies: concentration and centralization. Concentration of capital is the process through which an enterprise grows by the process of accumulation through time. This is to say that each round of production leaves the capitalist with a little surplus to invest in the next round of production. Concentration of capital is thus a historic process, as value accrues over time. And of course, as we have seen from Marx's perspective, growth is propelled through the exploitation and the theft of the workers' labor. The second concept is incredibly important and far-reaching. The centralization of capital is the process through which industries come to be dominated by fewer and fewer, larger and larger companies through the process of consolidation. It is concentration of capital already formed, destruction of their individual independence, expropriation of capitalists by capitalists, transformation of many small into few large capitals. This is different from concentration because capital is not being created. It is merely changing hands. The end result, of course, is a further concentration of capital. But rather than coming about through the creation of new capital, already existing capital changes hands through mergers, acquisition, and cutthroat competition, where companies that don't make it end up in bankruptcy and can be bought for cheap by their more solvent rivals. This process is evident in newer industries, particularly the tech sector, where startups rapidly pop up and then become absorbed by giants like Microsoft, Apple, and Google. Since the late 1980s, Microsoft has acquired more than 200 small firms and amassed ownership stakes at 60 others. In the same time span, Apple has acquired over 100, and these numbers do not include assets that Microsoft or Apple purchased from bankrupt firms. Most dramatically and aggressively, Google transformed itself from a simple search engine to an online monstrosity. Between 2001 and 2019, the firm completed more than 200 acquisitions of mostly small software firms. It now clocks in an average of one acquisition a week and controls about 3/4 of the market for digital search. Acquisitions have been integrated into services such as Google Groups, Blogger, Google Maps, the Android operating system, Google Docs, YouTube, and a myriad of other products that put Google at the center of almost anything you do online. And Google is now growing past its initial internet presence. It is now investing into driverless cars, artificial intelligence, healthcare technologies, and other products. In 2013, Google bought Waze, the navigation app with real-time user information, for $1.1 billion. They have yet to integrate Waze's technology into Google Maps. So most likely, this acquisition had more to do with the consolidation of Google's position in the market, trying to make sure that there are no competitors that could be a threat down the road. And these are not isolated instances. The number of mergers and acquisitions is reaching all-time highs. In 2018, companies announced approximately 50,000 transactions, with a total value of $3.8 trillion. Both the number of mergers and the acquisitions under values have set records in the last few years. As Harold Merson wrote for the American Prospect on the Washington Post, in recent months, Walgreens bought Rite Aid, uniting two of the nation's three largest drugstore chains. In Beerland, Molson Coors is buying Miller's. Mega health insurers Aetna and Anthem, respectively, bought mega health insurers Humana and Cigna. Heinz bought Kraft. Good news for those who take ketchup with their cheese. And American Airlines completed its absorption of US Airways, reducing the number of major US airlines to 4, which now control 70% of the air travel market. On Wall Street, the 5 biggest commercial banks hold nearly half of the nation's bank assets. In 1990, the 5 biggest held just 10%. What is more, both concentration and centralization feed back into the competitive struggle by creating further advantages for those companies that succeed in gaining the largest size. Marx argued, "The battle of competition is fought by the cheapening of commodities, and this depends in turn on the scale of production. Therefore, the larger capitals beat the smaller." It will further be remembered that with the development of the capitalist mode of production, there is an increase in the minimum amount of individual capital necessary to carry on a business under its normal conditions. Competition ends in the ruin of many small capitalists, whose capital partially passes into the hand of their conquerors and partially vanish completely. Marx here is describing the effects of what mainstream economists call economies of scale, which are cost advantages gained through operational efficiencies and economic leverage. As output grows, the average cost of producing a single unit falls. How does this work? Once a company has already paid for factory and office space, for storage and for delivery and transportation, then producing 10 times the amount of goods does not result in 10 times the cost, since the core expenses have already been paid for. Other sources of cost efficiencies have to do with the leverages that large companies have over smaller companies, including the ability to buy raw materials in bulk or forcing distributors to sell goods more cheaply. Small firms depend on larger ones, but the reverse is not true. Walmart, for example, is notorious for ruthlessly driving down prices in its efforts to lower costs. Walmart's more than 60,000 suppliers have little alternative as to who to sell their products to, so they are often forced to play ball, even if that means minimal profits in return. Walmart, however, is free to choose from thousands of different distributors and can thus easily coerce them into accepting unfavorable deals. Through centralization and concentration, which we have seen from Marx's perspective are outcomes of the competitive market, we arrive at the natural outcome of a capitalist system, the rise of monopolies. A monopoly is a lone company that dominates its market. For instance, Saudi Aramco, the state-owned Saudi oil and gas company. On the other hand, an oligopoly is a market dominated by a few very large companies such as Big Pharma or the auto industry. While pure monopolies are rare, monopolistic tendencies and practices abound, as ever larger companies use their increased clout to drive out competition. These processes transform a market of many competitive firms into one dominated by a handful of corporate behemoths, able to take advantage of their preeminent positions. In the words of journalist Matt Stoller, giant companies are operating as cartels, engaging in illegal conspiracies among themselves to divide up their turf. As a result, they have been able to fix the price of almost everything in the economy: antibiotics and other life-saving medication, fees on credit card transactions, essential commodities like cell phone batteries and electric cables and auto parts, the rates companies pay to exchange foreign currency, and even the interest rates on the municipal bonds that cities and towns rely on to build schools and libraries and nursing homes. A single price-fixing scandal by the world's largest banks fixing the global interest rates known as LIBOR involved more than $500 trillion in financial instruments. One of the most infamous modern-day monopoly is the biotech agricultural company Monsanto. The company specializes in environmentally toxic, genetically modified crops and seeds, and utilizes patents to dominate seed markets. In India, 95% of cottonseed is controlled by Monsanto, as Indian companies have been locked into joint ventures and licensing arrangements for the last couple of decades. Every patent and seed is the property of Monsanto, entitling them to royalties and driving up the price of seeds. Perhaps most shockingly is that these patented seeds have come to include gene use restriction technology, which are seeds that do not produce viable offspring seeds. In this way, farmers are forced to buy new seeds each harvesting season instead of just trying to get them from their harvest from the previous season. Monopolization clearly has a very profound impact on the supposedly free market principles touted by mainstream economists and ideologues. As former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich put it, those with the most economic power have been able to use it to alter the rules of the market to meet their own needs. As we have seen, a Marxist analysis pushes us to the conclusion that the impulse to manipulate the market is not reserved for the ultra-greedy or malicious, but is rather an outgrowth of the so-called free market itself. This is why a 2014 Goldman Sachs report basked in what they called dreams of oligopoly. There is a natural pull towards consolidation among mature or maturing industries. An oligopolistic market structure can turn a cutthroat commodity industry into a highly profitable one. Oligopolistic markets are powerful because they simultaneously satisfy multiple critical components of sustainable competitive advantages. A smaller set of relevant peers faces lower competitive intensity, greater stickiness and pricing power with customers due to the reduced choice, scale cost benefits including stronger leverage over suppliers, and higher barriers to new entrants all at once. Of course, pricing power here is just a euphemism for price gouging. By limiting consumer choice, as this Goldman Sachs analyst gleefully explains, oligopolies create conditions in which they can get away with almost anything. Because as consumers, we are stuck to the limited options that we have. The inflation of prices way past their values of goods and services turns almost every area of our lives into a nightmare. The pharmaceutical companies, or Big Pharma, are here largely to blame. The biggest of Big Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Merck & Co., they are certainly to blame for skyrocketing pharmaceutical costs, as well as the growing epidemic of addictions to painkillers and psychiatric drugs. But small pharma too, including many of the ones charged with producing ostensibly cheaper generic drugs, have gotten in on the game by creating monopolistic conditions through acquisitions and patent manipulation. Companies find a drug for which there is little market competition, buy out the firm that produces it, and then raise the prices. In this way, even smaller companies can mimic monopolistic conducts by cornering markets for particular drugs. This was exactly what Martin Shkreli and Turing Pharmaceuticals did. As Business Insider pointed out, for drugs like Daraprim, for which only about 8,000 prescriptions are filled a year, it simply isn't worth it for other companies to try to come up with generic alternatives. This allows for a price monopoly in which the drug manufacturer can set virtually any price it wants. Thus, the price of one Daraprim tablet, used mainly by HIV, AIDS, and cancer patients to battle parasitic infections, shot up overnight from $13.50 to $750. Shkreli defended this move in the same way that many pharma executives and apologists do, saying that the super profits are necessary to fund research and development. But this is a lie. Pharmaceutical companies spend at most 15 to 20% of their revenue in research and development. And those companies that have been pumping up prices the most aggressively tend to be those that spend the fewest amount on R&D. Take Valiant Pharmaceuticals, for example, which until recently was considered a star performer amongst companies of its size. Their business model is to use colossal amount of debt to fund a string of acquisitions. After an acquisition, as explained by the Financial Times, Valiant usually lifts prices and slashes R&D. The company spends a mere 3% of its revenue researching for new drugs. Meanwhile, in 2015 alone, it raised the price for 56 of their products, which corresponds to 81% of their portfolio and a 66% price rise overall. And so, for instance, someone's out-of-pocket expenses for battling Wilson's disease went from $510 a year in 2010 to $12,000 a year in 2014. And this is the irony of the free market. From a Marxist perspective, everything that I've mentioned so far is nothing but the system working exactly as intended. Marxists reject the idea that the market will regulate itself, or that it is actually driven in any meaningful capacity by the forces of supply and demand. They believe that companies will naturally and legally gain size, and corner markets so they don't have to compete to create the best or most affordable products. The system's ideologues promise us that the free market will deliver an efficient healthcare system, just as it will deliver peace on earth and a greener world. Yet the workings of the market lead to the exact opposite, the tyranny of a few corporate behemoths at the expense of all living things. This is what Marxism is all about: the rejection of the current economic model and the desire to form a new one. There exist plenty of possible alternatives. Many of them fall under an umbrella term called socialism, in which the driver behind production is human need rather than a compulsion to accrue an infinite amount of wealth at the expense of others. Marxists hope for a system in which human need is the driver behind important production decisions, and technology is developed in the quest for better and more sustainable forms of life. They criticize capitalism for relying on things like programmed obsolescence of low-quality goods designed to last the bare minimum and the shortest amount of time in order to keep customers returning for more. Marxists believe that under a capitalist organization of the economy, there exists no real incentive to produce high-quality, long-lasting products, because it simply is not profitable enough. For them, a capitalist system can only end with the downfall of civilized society once titanic companies dominate every aspect of it and make a political, economical, and environmental catastrophe inevitable. So this is what Marxism is all about. Do you have any questions? What is your opinion on it? Let me know in the comment section down below.